All right. Welcome, everybody. This is now the third year of our Operationalizing Locally Led Development webinar series. I'm really excited to have you all joining us again for a third year of conversations around this really important topic. My name is Jenna Thoritz, and I'm the Senior Manager for Global Initiatives at Humentum. And I'm just going to run you all through some housekeeping before I introduce our great panel of speakers, and then I will turn it over to them. First, I'd like to start by thanking our industry partners. These are organizations and companies that Humentum partners with that provide us support and you all support as the Humentum community. And we really thank them for their generous support in helping to make webinars like these possible. And in particular, I would like to thank this webinar's co-sponsor, the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network. They are a bipartisan coalition of international development and foreign policy practitioners, policy advocates, and experts from the U.S. and the Global South. They promote more effective and accountable U.S. foreign assistance that advances American interests, delivering greater results for people in need and U.S. taxpayers. And they focus very heavily on accountability and locally led development, so perfect for this webinar series. And we really thank them for their support in making this series possible as well. So just some housekeeping questions. If you have questions, put them in the chat. We'll be monitoring them, and Chris, our moderator, will be helping our panelists weave them throughout the conversation. We do have subtitles that are available. You can turn that on, either captions or transcription. We are recording this webinar, so you all will receive a follow-up email with a link. And we'll also be sharing this out on our social media. So if you have colleagues that were unable to join us today, please do help share the word. And without further ado, let me introduce our fantastic panel. So we have Chris Prue from Humentum, who's going to be our moderator. We have Faye Ekon from Ravelworks Africa, Princess Basili Bethea, who is a board member at CDA Collaborative, and Amy Gavin, who is the Managing Director of Neuro Nigeria. So I'm really thrilled to invite them all to join our panel today, and really excited to have this conversation. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Chris, and we will get started on the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Jenna, and welcome everybody. It's great to see all of you here, and great to see some familiar faces or names in the participant list and some new guests as well to our webinar series. So thanks everyone for coming. As Jenna said, we've been running these locally led development webinar series. This is our third year. This is the kickoff event for our 2024 series, really exploring a number of themes really related to how we can flip the script on development and in general, make it more local and community led. And what's really exciting about today's conversation is we're going to focus less on systems and processes, which is where we have focused a lot of our attention in some of the prior series. And we're actually going to talk about what are some of the individual leadership practices that show up when we're trying to do this. And super excited about the panel that we've been able to bring together because they really bring three different perspectives on different leadership models that are emerging in our sector and beyond. And hope today is a conversation, as Jenna said, please do put your questions, comments, insights in the chat. And my job is to try to weave those into the conversation that we already have planned for you today. So I'll be doing that, and that just makes it much more lively and eventful for everybody. Overall leadership often is framed sometimes either from models that work really well in the corporate sector or models that are very Western oriented or sometimes even male oriented. And I think we're going to kind of dig into a lot of that today and explore different ways that leaders are showing up in different kinds of contexts. And then talk a little bit about how can we scale that up in a way to kind of make development more equitable, resilient, and accountable across the entire sector. This is my reminder again to just double check your mics and make sure you're muted if at all possible, so that we can just minimize the background. So what I'm going to do is I am going to give each of the panelists a chance to, first of all, introduce themselves and their work a little bit, but also kind of share with you the perspective that they're bringing to this particular conversation before we get into some of the Q&A. So I'm going to invite Faye Khan, the Managing Director of RavelWorks Africa, to kind of come on mic first here and give us a little overview of the work that she's been doing. Faye, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me, and thank you for all of us joining us today. So, like Chris said, I'm the managing director of a management consultancy firm called RavelWorks Africa. I know sometimes oh, I think somebody's not muted. Okay, right. So I know sometimes when people hear the word RavelWorks, you think we are a construction company and you're wondering what is a construction company telling us about locally led development. So we are in the construction business, but not in the way you're thinking. So we don't build buildings. We are really focused on building organizations, and specifically in line with what does the future of work actually look like in terms of the confidence, the skills, the experience, the interaction, the relationships that we need to have. So that's what we do. We're headquartered in Nairobi. Interestingly, though, we thought we were going to conquer the African market when we started many years ago. But the majority of our clients actually is in the US, Canada, Europe. So seems we have something to offer to that market as well. So the lens that we're going to look at today, from at least my perspective, is really looking at how do our mental models shape the way we practice leadership and management, and how we interact with our teams and other stakeholders. So I stop there, Chris.
Great, thank you. We'll construct some new leadership models hopefully today, Faye, as we go, right? So Princess Basley Bethea is a board member at CDA Collaborative Learning Projects. She's based in DC. So I'll invite Princess to explain a little bit about her work and her perspective on this. Princess, welcome.
Great, thank you. Yes, thank you, Chris and Jenna and Humentum for bringing us together. I'm joining from the Washington, D.C. area, specifically the Piscataway Indigenous lands. And so my work in this space, I'll be talking a bit about, or we'll be sharing a bit about some work with CDA Collaborative Learning Projects, where I'm a board member, but also in the space professionally, I'm a DEI leader. And so when I think about the title, Flipping the Script on Leadership, for me, it means two things. It's both personal and professional. And so as I think about like my remarks today, I'm trying to focus on one word as for each of your questions. And the word is really access. And so professionally, the access that I have seen just the sector take for providing new and opening, right, the doors for other people to take leadership roles, right, for that leadership shift to change. And so I think, I've been in the space for about 20 years. And so literally seeing the demographic change of leaders, and not just the C-suite leaders, but people management leaders, middle management leaders, there has been a big shift in leaders that's great, right? I also think, though, that the positive parts of that also include the shifts around our leaders thinking about values-based leadership, and how that has then informed the way our different organizations or companies or agencies go about doing their mission. And so that shift over the past 20 or so years around just not only providing the access, but letting those new faces really lead the way that they are authentically leading. And I think then to think about that authenticity is the second part of what flipping the script means to me, and that's the personal piece. And so being in this space, and not coming in as a leader, but definitely coming in entry level, coming in as an intern, actually I started as a Peace Corps volunteer. And so personally, seeing doors open and leadership change and shifts change and how we deliver our missions helped me to show up authentically in times where I have been in my career in the room, have been the only Black person or the only woman or the only Black female. And knowing that the work, right, of generations before me, maybe 10, 20, or a couple of other generations ahead of me, where they were also building the game and playing the game and opening those doors. I think now that I'm in it and I have access to it, it's personally a part of the outcome of flipping the script, but also the ownership that I now have, right, to continue that same flipping the script as we think about what's next, right? And I think that's the really the theme of the series, right, is thinking about now what. And we can't rest on our laurels. We can't rest on the fact that we have more diversity. We can't rest on those things. Like, what is our now ownership around this, and what can we then do for generations coming up to have that same access as they move into these leaderships, and then also as a sector as we begin to reframe into locally led development and local leadership. And I'll stop there. Over.
Great. Thanks, Princess. A lot we're going to be able to sort of unpack there as well. And so I'm going to invite Amy Gaiman to come on screen as well. Amy is the managing director for New Nigeria and leading all their work across Nigeria, and especially in the Northeast. And she'll talk to us about that. So Amy, welcome.
Hello, thank you so much, Chris. And then I'm glad to be joining Faye and Princess on this call. Powerful women, African women who are changing and flipping the script city. So for Nuru Nigeria, we are part of a global collective. We like to call ourselves the Nuru Collective. And in this global collective, we have Nuru Kenya, Nuru Ethiopia, Nuru Burkina Faso, Nuru Ghana, and Nuru International, which is based in the United States. So the core competence of our organization is basically in this aspect that is called localization. And I'm excited that we are talking about localization today and how we can operationalize localization. Nuru works with farmers, and then localization does not stop with us. That is a local Nigerian organization. But localization is also about the farmers leading themselves out of extreme poverty, owning farmer organizations by themselves, owning cooperatives, and working in groups, that way, we are building capacity and ensuring resilience, especially in fragile areas like the Northeast, given the Boko Haram insurgency, all the vulnerability that exists with crisis also. We have to ensure that there is resilience, and then the community are actually leading themselves, not just for us as Nuru as a local organization. For me today, I'm going to speak about, I'm excited about flipping the script because I said there is an African proverb that says, you cannot shave a man's head in his absence. So you cannot say you are doing development for a particular community when the community are not part of the development, or aspiration is not recognized or taken into consideration while that approach is happening, while their development is happening. So we want to ensure that community take ownership of their own development. Key things I'm going to be talking about, basically, when it comes to leadership and then flipping the script, like today's topic says, is about cultural competence. How do we ensure that we are interacting and actually harnessing the capacities that exist in the communities that we serve? And how do we ensure that communities are owning this? And how do we even recognize the competence that exists in the communities where we say probably the beneficiaries are not educated, but they have like histories that we have not tapped into to recognize what they have gone through and what it means to them and what the change of flipping the script actually means to them. So a key term I would like us to unpack today when it comes to leadership is cultural competence. Thank you so much. And I look forward to all the conversations and the learning that will happen in this room.
Beautiful. Thank you, Amy. When we, just for the rest of you, when we had our prep call last week, the four of us, the question was, is there anything that someone here couldn't say that would be too radical or to offend anybody on the group? And we're like, no, we want everyone to kind of go for it. And certainly from my perspective, as a white, male, American, Gen X, someone who's been leading since my teens, I know that I am very much on this learning journey as well. And my frame of leadership shouldn't be universalized. And so I really encourage everybody as you're listening today, we've definitely, the panel is going to challenge themselves to put ideas out there that hopefully will generate some level of response. And even if that response is a little uncomfortable, I hope that it encourages you to ask a question or a follow-up in the chat. So So let's just get started. I'm going to go back to you, Faye. We'll kind of start there. I mean, the structure of this will be, I'm going to kind of spend a little bit of time with each person unpacking their particular perspective. And then we've got some questions where we're going to kind of talk a bit as a group, and I'm going to try to encourage a little back and forth as well. So Faye, you've recently been writing about this concept of Ubuntu leadership. So could you tell us a little bit about what you're researching there, and what perspective is sort of coming forward as you do that work?
Yeah, Chris, and the more you research, the less you know, right? That's kind of the characteristic of it. But when we say Ubuntu here for purposes of this webinar, it's kind of an umbrella term. I mean, in Kenya, we call it Utu. In Tanzania, it's Ujamaa, and we have a lot of similar kind of philosophies across the continent. But what we're really looking at is African humanism, Afro-centered leadership, and what does that actually mean when you put it into organizations? And why have we not had that? So that has been one of my big, let's say, interests or concerns over the last couple of years, that most of our leadership and management approaches that we use in organizations, whether in the private sector, NGO, or even public sector, are traditionally coming from the West. Bit more Japanese now coming with Kaizen and this kind of stuff, but generally speaking, we're taking Western models on what does it mean to be a leader, how do you manage your team, how do you do A, B, C, D, E, and we try to import them into, in our case, a sub-Saharan African system, and then we start wondering, why does it not work? And we negate and neglect some of our very own ways of managing our communities, of showing up, because maybe it has not been researched in the same academic rigor as you would have in a US university or European university. You didn't do empirical data collection, all of these things. And so that's basically what I started to get interested in, is how can we use some of the ways that we show up for each other on the continent and actually translate that into leadership or management approaches, particularly, again, in our future of work, where we all know, as much as technology is there, yes, but we also know we're moving to a much more human and people-centered kind of work environment. Organizations that put their people first will have a competitive or sustainable advantage. And so some of the ways that we interact, Ubuntu is one of them, is very much centered on, a collective approach, much more human-centered approach, and anchored in African humanism. I stop there, Chris, before I go into my whole research project here.
Yeah, I mean, I think just a quick follow-up to that. Are you talking about trying to develop an Afrocentric leadership model that works in Africa? Or are you exploring, like, how can this actually work for the future of work, no matter where we work, and no matter what kinds of work we're doing?
Correct.
Yeah.
So correct. I mean, it's two things, right? It's, on the one hand, what do we have on the continent that we can anchor ourselves in, that is anchored in the social, contextual, and cultural markers of our continent, and not. I'll give a very practical example. US is a good example, actually. It's very much the shareholder model, making money for the shareholders. That sits very much in contrast with some of the ways that we work here. So if you look at the US organization vis-a-vis, I'm not going to speak for all of Africa, but definitely East Africa. If you have a problem as Chris, the individual in your organization, I don't know, your grandmother is sick, your cousin is whatever, that is your problem. Here, on the other hand, everybody rallies around. We have WhatsApp groups, people start contributing, okay, I will do this, I will get the car, it's a very collective approach, even though I've never met your grandmother. I don't know who she is, but we understand that you are because I am because you are. So we're looking at it from those two perspectives. You've also said, can it be used, more widely? My belief, I still need to prove it, is yes, because I know that the rest of the world is going towards a more people-centered approach. Well, where do we find that? One angle is in Ubuntu, which is much more, it's not just about me, but if I succeed and the rest of you fail, well, none of us has really gained anything for more than a month or two. I got a bonus, and then we collapse next month, for example. Yeah.
Right. And I actually think, as having worked my entire career in the US, like, we think we're making progress because we can now just talk about the fact that my grandmother is unwell. Right.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Whereas there was a certain period of time where you just didn't even talk about that, let alone like it just being your problem. Right. And we feel like we're making progress now that we can just say, well, actually, I've got this little situation. that's going on. And it doesn't go even as far as the model that you're sort of describing there, right? So I'm gonna pivot over to Princess here for a minute, because it seems like this connects a lot to what you were talking about, especially around access and authenticity. So maybe you could sort of pick up, and especially from the view of it of sort of DEI programs in the US, and what are the lessons that can be applied globally when we're thinking about locally led development, and maybe some places where it can't be applied.
Great. So I guess whereas I talked about access, right, brought that word in, the word I would bring in into this set of remarks is really around fairness. And for me, where I sit, especially in a country where DEI is being constantly attacked on so many different levels, where I see it is that it is effective, right? The thing that is effective is that which is attacked, right? And so because fairness is contagious, diversity is contagious, inclusion isn't contagious, right? Once we see these principles and these practices being successful in different pockets, everyone also wants that same thing, right? And so I think that just goes to show that communities, local communities, underserved groups, underrepresented groups are really supportive, even if they don't understand the acronym or et cetera. They are supportive of fairness, that, you know, people want fairness, they want equality, they want power sharing, right? Those are the principles. And so as DEI has sort of become an organizational function, right? Because it's become industrialized, it's a whole thing now, it's a whole technical space. And, you know, we can break down those words, diversity, equity, inclusion, if you add on belonging and justice, accessibility, all of those things represent, again, those principles. And it's the principles to make actionable, the principles around fairness, around access, around power sharing, around transparency, right, are the aspects that we want to make actionable. And that's just really the approach to DEI, DIB is really the approach to see those things actionable. So as far as lessons learned, where leaders, right, are embracing that language, I think it has, there have definitely been challenges, right? So I think just to start there, right, that recognizing the first thing around challenges is to start internally, right? And so I think a lot of leaders have had to wrestle and understand what these principles mean for themselves as they lead. And this is even before they get into mission work or get into another country or region or do that sort of work. What does this mean for how I operate inside my organization, how I operate my team, how we pay our staff, how we do benefits for our staff, how we do promotions for our staff? Like just even that operations part really has to be a part of the conversation. And that's even before you start to do that mission delivery work that makes us feel good, or while we're showing up, or while we're serving, or while we're supporting. Both things have to equal up. And so I think that the DEI approaches give tools and sort of competencies to help leaders answer those challenging questions, and then help their policies and their processes and their practices align with those principles. And then, right, the next challenging part is, how do we share that? How do we expand it? How do we make it, socialize it, right, abroad? And again, language is not equal, right? It's not always race in other countries or in other regions. It's not always gender issues. It's not always age issues, right? So then you have to, a part of that, give up ownership of what fairness looks like. And that's where that first word comes in, access, right? So when there are more voices at the table, more opportunities to have that work be informed, you really start to see the DEI work become contextualized and relevant to local contexts. And so again, it's about that diversity, having, you know, we say local, but really having, right, Latin American, East African, West African, South Asian, East Asian, really having people be around the table when making these decisions and socializing these principles, right? The principles are shared, the values are shared, but they look different when it's lived out and when it's contextualized in the region. And that's when we get to local leadership. And that's when we start to see the shifts change and the shifts in power around those aspects. And I think, the best practice that for me, this is the simplest way to go. Bring in the diversity. Bring in the diversity, share the power, and have that diversity inform practices, policies along these values that everyone shares.
So just a quick follow-up for you, and then I've got a way to connect this a little bit to something Amy's working on. So a lot of INGOs, and there are definitely, I know some INGO leaders on this call, are definitely globalizing their HQ, right? They're no longer having a place-based headquarters where there's all their senior leadership team sits, and they're moving these senior leadership roles to all over their scope of where they're working, right? And what unique opportunities or possibly challenges does that present from the perspective that you're talking about? So the one piece that it addresses, I think, with what you're saying is it's now going to diversify the voices around the table. But maybe what should those teams be doing to sort of think about how to make sure that the right principles and values are coming forward as you're doing that, and that you just don't sort of export, right, the way the organization was being run in America to the leader in Nairobi or Joburg or Bangkok, who most represents that leadership approach and style. So it's a little off script. It wasn't on our plan, but I want to toss it to you anyway.
No, it's true. And I mean, I think that's the nature of colonialism and imperialism, right? Like just making little pockets of Western culture in different areas. And it's exactly the opposite. And I think that this idea of DEI being integrated into all aspects of systems change and operations change. And also, we didn't want to talk about institutions, but also institutionally, right? So these shifts, in order to truly take hold, have to also happen in philanthropy, right? Have to also happen in government, have to also happen in education and academia, have to also happen in all of these other pockets, which, I think there's always doom and gloom, right? Because we get a lot of bad news and we see bad news. But honestly, if you go under, these industries are some faster, some slower, making these changes because, as I said before, fairness is contagious. Equality is contagious. And the movement for this, won't be successful if it only happens in the C-suite, right? If you only change that director or that executive director. But once these things change throughout all of the systems, and that ownership of having things change throughout all of the systems of US government, UK government, all of these pockets that have power, right? So power, I think this is one of the questions later. One of you sort of asked us about what's the misconception about leadership, but the misconception is that power is only held in the C-suite, right? There are so many things and aspects at play in this sector, right? So many things. And it's not just held in the C-suite or where the headquarters are. And so I think that we have to call to the table and expand this conversation beyond this locally led development conversation. And of that, it's great that it's happening in the sector and with INGOs and that they're moving, but it is not going to sustain only on that route, right? There has to be all of these other players that have to also adopt and hold up those same values. And I think that, right, some aspects of other industries are doing it well and better, but it will take, I'd say philanthropy over and over again, because that's funding. Where the money goes, despite where your headquarters is still a huge problem, and still a part of the issue. But in the same breath, I do want to say that there's really great movement and really great organizations and groups that are decolonizing philanthropy. And I hope that, I'm sure you all have that conversation or have already had it. So all is not lost, but I think that is definitely a multi-sector, multi-industry approach to really see the sustained change.
Awesome, great. So we'll, I think, definitely come back to that theme. So thank you for teasing that out. I'm gonna bring Amy in here. Amy, when you did your intro, you talked about the Nuru Collective, and I know that you sit on I believe it's called the Global Council, for the New Brew Collective. So that in and of itself, I think, is a leadership innovation. And maybe you can talk a little bit about how you and your colleagues, what it is, and then maybe a little bit how you and your colleagues then use that to make decisions across the collective.
All right, sure. Thank you so much. So I will talk about a bit about the Neuro Collective. So Neuro Collective is an aggregation of local organizations, like I said earlier, in different African countries. But we have I like to say our sibling in the United States, because I wouldn't say our headquarters. Neuro International is by all means not our headquarters. So we have our sibling in the United States. Now, what that does for us is the Neuro International actually co-creates and co-found most of the African organizations. When they find an African organization, they look for a local leader like myself to form Neuro Nigeria. And with having myself as the head of Neuro Nigeria, what it means is that I also sit on the board of Neuro Nigeria. So I'm able to take decision for this local organization. So at the first part of the transitioning, we do a lot of capacity development, mentoring, gradually shifting the power and also ensuring that there is a change in decision-making, that the local organization, Neuro Nigeria, is able to take decisions on its own and is able to lead its own developmental approach. However, there is a challenge with that, right? There are some challenges that emanate from that. After 2 years or 3 years of being together with Neuro International, the local organization is already used to going to the room together with Neuro International, having meetings with Neuro International on the side and all of those things. So that has enhanced, like just having a white person in the room, usually just enhance your legitimacy. It enhances your credibility as an organization and all of those. Then you now have the white person transitions. So that is where an organization like Stopping Our Success comes in, to ensure that this transition is done responsibly, right? It is done gradually, intentionally, and very, very responsible. Then the Global Collective, let me shift to the Global Council of Neuro. The Global Council of Neuro is a collection of all the strategic leadership team of all Neuro organizations. So we all sit on a global advisory council where we share power and then we share capacity. We are able to take decisions together, advise each other. We have a sense of global solidarity, that you are not alone in this. If this is something that you need the technical expertise of someone from the US, then the person comes in. If you need someone from Kenya, the person comes in. If you need someone from Burkina Faso, that shared sense of solidarity just empowers you and gives you more strength to push on, whether it is in a discussion with donors, whether it is in a conversation with another partner that you want to engage with. It just gives you the sense of you're not left alone. There is someone behind you. You have a community behind you who are actually rooting for you, But this community is not by any means, trying to impose anything on you. It has to be done together. Recognizing, like what I said earlier, recognizing the cultural competence of each individual. So in terms of flipping the script, like in terms of just going into this development work and bringing it back to what Princess was saying about equitability. So the Global Advisory Council brings that sense of equity together. It brings that sense of partnership. It brings that sense of joint legitimacy and then solidarity. Now, in flipping the script for us in Neuro is also leaving the level of the Global Council and bringing it to the level of the local actor now. At the level of the local actor, which is someone like Neuro Nigeria, we also have to engage with a cohort of other local institutions, which is the farmer organization or secondary cooperative. What we do is not just to engage farmers and then do, no, you are participants, you are beneficiaries, we have finished the work and we are leaving your community and we go to the next community, we have scaled, we have expanded. No, we stay with the local community and empower the farmer organization, ensure they are registered, that means they are also legitimate, ensure that they have the capacity to access funding for themselves, access grants, ensure that they can do business, they have the business acumen to do business by themselves. I would like to bring in another African proverb. You know, if you're, this is common in Nigeria. So usually in Nigeria, there is a proverb that says, what an elder can see when sitting down, a young person cannot see it when he climbs the highest mountain. So why am I bringing it in the context of this conversation? The fact that when you go to a community, when you want to ensure locally led development, when you go to the community, you are automatically that young person. You know, the people who have lived in that community for the longest time are actually those elders. They might not have the MBAs, they might not have they might not be the ones that are wearing the suits, they might not be the ones with the laptop and everything, but they have a kind of knowledge and skill that you are not fully aware of. So when you talk about climate change, for example, what does that mean in their context? You know, how have they seen it historically? What are the patterns that have changed? What are they seeing and what does that mean in their own institution? So this global solidarity leaves the level of Nuru International, Nuru Nigeria, Nuru Collective, the Global Council, to the level of the farmer organization. So, but all of us, we see each other as one unit. We see each other as partners, sharing power together and able to share in solidarity to each other.
There's so much there I want to follow up on. Maybe I'm trying to decide where to start. I'm going to start actually with the comment you made early on in your remarks about each of the members of the collective are essentially siblings. And you described the support you provide each other, knowing that, you know, someone else essentially has your back and so on. But siblings don't always see eye to eye. And I'm curious about two things. One, when there are disagreements, what does that look like? And what looks different when there isn't someone at the table who, by the purpose of structure, has more power, right? Because in theory, if you're siblings, you're all there as equals. And then the second is maybe as reflecting even on your own experience, like what competencies and skills need to show up as a leader to operate in that kind of environment? Over to you.
All right, so I would like to go first to your first question. When there is a disagreement, right, like I said, there is power sharing in that level. So it's like when there is a disagreement, which is bound to happen as siblings, you know, and every time this happens, everybody sits together, everybody is involved, everybody is engaged, everybody is included in all the conversations and the discussions and everything that is happening that relates to that disagreement, right? However, one of the key principles of that kind of system is that you in the room should just know that whatever is going on is not about you as the person. It's about the mission, the vision, the values. It's not about you as an individual. It's always key to it is about the vision and the values of the organization. So we have not had like so much wide disagreement as a group. However, when there is an issue, let's say if the issue is Nuru Nigeria, then the most insights has to come from me, who is leading Nuru Nigeria, right? I will discuss with my team also, know what are the possible solutions they have on the ground, what are they thinking, what's the best direction, what's the best strategy for us as Nuru Nigeria. Then I present it. And that's where the cultural competence come into play. Because the person who is in Nuru, Burkina Faso, will not know how to solve the issue that relates to Nuru Nigeria, even though the person is from Africa, even though the person is from West Africa, you know, and even when it's Nigeria, the person who is outside Northeast Nigeria might not be able to relate well with the situation in the Northeast. So recognizing where the competence of each person lies is what helps us solve issues. And we have like clear pattern for decision making, right? And all the clear structures, they are well defined. So for an issue with Nuru Nigeria has to go to the board of Nuru Nigeria too. The board also exists, even though there is a global council, but the board of that organization also still exists, and nobody tries to force any opinion on anybody, you know, so we mostly share opinion and understand that we are sharing capacity at that level. Please, Chris, could you come in with your second question so that I can respond to it? So.
Yeah, that's fine. Sorry for throwing two questions out at once. So the second question was, as an individual leader, you know, even reflecting on your own experience, what kinds of competencies, skills, behaviors need to show up to operate really well in this kind of shared power environment?
All right, so I will say bring in your authentic self, you know. One of the key areas of localization, one of the key elements is trust. So if you don't bring in your authentic self, what it means is that over time, it is going to show. If you need solidarity from other people, if you need to be in this together, then you need to build that trust and you need to work hard to build that trust and you need to do it together, you know. So always bring your authentic self to the room. Always be open, you know, be able to be vulnerable and speak your truths. Where you are struggling, you have to share that you are struggling. Vulnerability does not mean that you are not strong, right? Always try as much as possible to speak your truth. Understand the concept of partnership and understand that most of the partnership you seek to have, most of the allies that you need on your journey are there to build your resilience and are there to support you. They are there for you. So tap into any resources that you can get. I don't believe that, like, you should ask a lot of questions. For me, I feel like I get most of my responses from the questions that I ask. Get into the room, ask the right questions. Do not be soft on it. Ask the most difficult questions that need to be said in the room, right? If you feel like this question needs to be asked, because you're not just asking for yourself, you're also asking for the community that you serve, you know. I also want to say that as a leader, I always feel we need to recognize the opportunities that we have. We need to recognize even the privilege of information, right? The fact that I am sitting in this room, there are so many voices of people that are behind me, you know, that I am sitting on their back and then voicing this opinion. So I have to recognize that this opportunity sitting in this room is also carrying along some powerful voices within the communities that I am serving, because it's the learnings that I have gained from those communities that I am bringing to this room. So you have to recognize the opportunity that you have, just being educated and all of those, and also be able to, in all humility, sit with the person who is in that community to co-create and design programs that are well suited for that community, recognizing that they also have the initiative. They might not be able to speak in platforms like this, like I would be able to do, but they also have the initiative to design their own solution, and they understand the problem better than you do. It's very important. So I think that's my take on that.
Yeah, great, Amy. And I think that, you know, what's ringing in my head as you say all of that is your proverb about what an elder can see when sitting is more than what a young person can see when climbing a mountain, right? Is that about, the person closest to any particular situation, right, has the most visibility, has the most voice, even if they don't have the platform, as we're sort of talking about here. So Faye, I'm going to go off script now with you. So we've been just talking with Amy about some of the individual leadership capabilities that need to show up, competencies. I'm curious, based on your work, if there's anything you would add to that list. And then what's interesting, right, is in Amy's situation is they built a collective institutional structure to also support a shift in individual leadership. You're working with a lot of clients that might still be operating in very traditional forms. So how do you show up as a leader trying to apply different approaches in a structure that might be very traditional, at least Western traditional, I should say. Yeah.
Yeah. And actually, Amy, you said some very interesting things as well, because you were saying, what my issue is in Burkina Faso, somebody from Ghana or Nigeria or Cote d'Ivoire cannot necessarily fix it for me, even if we're all West Africans here. And I think, Chris, to that point, what Amy was saying, I mean, the way we lead is anchored in our mental models. And when I talk about mental models, this is deeply held assumptions, beliefs, values, etc., about what a leader should look like, what that means. And that comes from our backgrounds, our culture, our religion, all of these kind of things. So linking to what Amy said is, on the one hand, in most cases, we are not even aware that we hold those mental models, okay? So in the humanitarian development sector, for a long, long time, project manager, head of finance, country director is white. That is what goes into people's minds. It's a white man in most cases, okay? So that is a mental model. The fact, like Amy is saying, we make the assumption that because I've spent 6 months in Uganda, I'm an East Africa expert. That is crazy. And we need to be explicit about some of those implicit bias and assumptions that we hold. Because the same way, Chris, just because you've been to London 4 times in your life does not make you a Europe expert, that you now, tell the rest of us how Europe needs to organize themselves. But somehow when it comes particularly to Africa, that's what we've done. You've done a, 2-year stint, and all of a sudden you're telling us from all the way from Ethiopia to South Africa what needs to be done. There's a lot of kind of arrogance in that approach. Amy was just talking about humility. So I think one of the key things that we are working with our leaders, and it's very hard to do it, is those mental models that you hold implicitly. You need to make them explicit, because it's easy to work on those kind of structure. We need a new policy, or we are changing the organogram. 25% of funding should go to a local organization. But we are not actually addressing all of these other things behind it. And what does that mean for you? I'm just saying, Chris, you as an example. What does that mean for you? Your identity that you've carried for 25 years, that I'm an M&E expert, I'm a gender specialist, I'm a head of blah, 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 blah. You need to unpack some of those things. So without that self-awareness and without addressing some of these things, which can very often be very uncomfortable. And Amy was saying about bringing your, authenticity. Hard, because that some of the beliefs and values and assumptions that you hold are not very nice. Let's be truthful, and so, but we have to put this on the table. So even the assumption that we make about, capacity building. Well, who is to say that people in South Sudan, in Chad, in Congo, who are you to say I'm going to build capacity there? So it's a mental model that my way of doing things is the one that's required in order to advance development and this kind of stuff and progress. So that's one. And so whether, the noodle model is a very nice one. You were asking me the second question about how do we do it in more traditional organizations. That's really where we start, Chris. It's at the mental models, and people don't often like us when we first go in because what people want is to say, oh, I'm doing a new policy. I'm doing a gender DEI policy. I'm putting KPIs. I'm doing a RACI to say who's responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. None of that makes any difference. That's the easiest thing for us to do. But we've got to understand why not. What in my identity is blocking me from really doing that? Because what does it say about me and how I'm perceived as a leader? What makes me believe that leadership is a certain way? Why do I dismiss my, in quotes, local partners on the ground? Because I believe I know it better. And to finally, just my last point to Amy's point is, even the more local you go, the more irrelevant the concept even becomes. The whole localization agenda, all of these things, those are conversations in Washington, in Geneva, and in London. It was very important there. But when we really go into it, it doesn't matter. What we know is what works in my community in Kenya. Maybe I can give you some tips. It might work in Uganda, might not be relevant at all, right? So it's that humility there to say, I am actually not an expert in anything. I know very little about a very, very small piece of information because I happen to be stationed in DRC for 2 years. And if you have that humility, then we can make some progress here. Over.
Thank you, Faye. I'm going to bring Princess back in now because Faye introduced the concept of the mental model and our identity, and extended that identity all the way out to our professional identity, the expertise we developed, the different education and work experiences we have. So from an Uber view of DEIB and especially inclusion, that almost in some ways almost seems like it's even more insidious to get at, right? As how does that expertise show up? And when we're talking about specifically flipping the script on development and being a little more locally led, I'm curious what you've seen is really being supportive of getting people to even check that at the door, in addition to all the other elements of their identity that they might be carrying. So
yeah, sure. I think, right, to add in just like another simple word, I think it's respect, right? And it is the word respect that also is a principle undergirding, right, these conversations. And one of the first lessons, right, of like reimagining, redefining, whatever word you want to put it, to Western traditional leadership is respect of the other, of other knowledge, of other approaches, of other people, of other ways of achieving success, of other ways of delivering foreign assistance, humanitarian assistance. And it is one of the aspects, right, that this DEIAB work is really trying to equip people with that, right, that undoing, that unlearning of respect for the other. And so in societies, right, where individualism and keeping your head down and getting that expertise and going to college and getting that master's degree and that doctorate and that sort of thing is sort of the way to become a leader, and the way to show knowledge in a space that really reframing all of that to respect of the other is one of the aspects I think that has to be a part of the power shifts that we want to see in locally led development. And I think that, the example of like even the semantics of locally led development is a word, is a terminology, because even as Amy spoke about how even where Nigeria sits, they didn't have to do those same practices for farmers and vendors and program participants and et cetera. Like it's a practice, right? And you can call it locally led development, you can do all of these things, but it's a practice that must happen at every level. It happens it happens with your taxi drivers, your interns, your volunteers. Like it's not just this grandiose idea that only happens, right, with the decision makers in Geneva, but it must be carried out and played through. And that level of respect for everyone, no matter what position they hold, where they're sitting at, where they're entering, right, this space of change, because the space of change is held by everyone, by the people who are receiving and who are in need. It's also held by those who are showing up in person. It's held by the IT person and the procurement person in Washington, D.C. Those levels of respect and that ownership of respect is held by everyone in this space. And so, yeah, I think I would leave it with that word. It's the respect.
I'm going to throw again another sort of provocative question, and I'm happy to have any of you pick it up, but maybe just while I have you, Princess, if you have a first view on it, but I'm welcome Faye and Amy to kind of chime in. Yeah, at some point, one of the INGOs that we were working with, which had done a lot of work at decentering its leadership team in the US and building a global leadership team, but also was talking about some of these more radical concepts, actually got pushback from some of the leaders outside the US and saying, wait a minute, I've done everything you told me I was supposed to do, right? I went and got that master's degree or PhD. I've climbed the quote unquote NGO corporate ladder to be able to get in this role, right? And now you're saying, we're going to change the whole way we think about leadership here, when I've been trying to follow the model or the mental model that Faye was using, right, of what leadership was going to look like. And so as a devil's advocate kind of question, like maybe just how do we address that point and say, right, are we throwing it all the way here? Or are we keeping elements of this? And how do you help people kind of crosswalk from the path that they were on, that they thought they were on the right path, and now we're saying, oh no, we want to now value some of these other characteristics as well, and it's not just what shows up on your CV, for example. So I don't know, Princess, you want to take a first crack, and then I'll see.
Yeah, I can take a crack. I have a couple of thoughts. I'll try to organize in just like two thoughts. My first thought that comes to mind is there has to be a shared values, right? And so some people do not share our values. And so sometimes I just like to bring that into the space, right? There will be people who aren't aligned with being on board with the type of change we want to see. And sometimes I think we have to bring that into the room and say that out loud. You get on board, we can help you to get on board. We can skill you up to get on board. We can toolkit you, partner, if you want to be on board. But if you are one of these people who do not want to be on board, then there's probably another great job and another great industry out there for you. So I do think we have to take the ownership of that. Like everyone's not going to be getting on this train for change, right? And I will offer, right, the space, but that does not change how we're going to show up, right? We're making these changes. We're going to be showing up in this way. But, second to that point, the reframing, right, of the entire system has to change, right? So that idea of titles, of levels of education, of all of these things being valued or carrying a high weight, it has to change. And that's slowly changing, right? Like you are seeing more opportunities where lived experience, where other aspects of learning are being valued and brought into the space. And it is a slow change, but I think that there are opportunities that we must take, right, to really change the idea of what's value and what's contribution in this space. And, there are models, right? There's definitely this, the collective from Nigeria model, but there are also models where some INGOs have, pulled out, right, their US or their Western staff and had them be advocates on Capitol Hill in the US or advocates at the UN, and let those local leaders run things locally in the country, right? And so there are opportunities and there are ways that everyone can serve. And there are places where everyone is probably even better or best served, be it best able to serve. And so, there is that model. There are different models of where positions and titles and your contribution can be redefined and redesigned to align with these values that we're trying to hold up. And it doesn't just have to be, oh, you need to leave the sector out completely. No, maybe you come back to the US and you tell the story, or you write the policy, the laws, or you do something differently. But I think that it's not until we explore and understand different models and raise up best practices like Nigeria, which more can be found in the Stopping for Success of how INGOs are actually going about aligning and really putting locally led development as a part of the way they run their organizations. So the models are out there. You don't have to necessarily lose your job or change your whole career, but there is a way to show up in this space in a way that enhances fairness and respect and shared power.
Excellent, Princess. And I just want to point out that, yeah, Jenna did put the link to Stopping at Success in the chat for anybody who wants to learn a little bit more about that initiative and obviously how it played out at Nigeria as well. Anybody else want to come in on that question? Or because I've got a question from the chat that I'm happy to go to as well from Patrick here. But I'll give Faye or Amy a chance on that question I just asked Princess. Nope. Faye?
Like Princess has said, no, it's not about, we're not saying throw everything out, right? We're saying let's expand our minds and let's look at other ways of leading and of doing things that might be non-traditional, but that doesn't mean they're bad and they can't work. So, you pick and choose a little bit from everywhere and see what makes the most sense to me. I think one of the things, Princess, as you've been talking as well, I mean, it's not locally led development, as it is called, it's not about getting Black or brown people to color the room and saying, look here, I've got 3 Black leaders and 4 Asian and 2, and now I'm good to go. But they can lead as long as they are like me. As long as they studied in the US, they did this, they blah, 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 blah. That's not locally led development. That's just changing the color of your leadership. And so I know in some of the DEI work that we have done as well, people are also not stupid. They know that you are requesting me to be a regional director because you want a Black woman and it will look good for you. It's got nothing to do with because you believe in my, abilities or my vision, etc. So that's, again, it's very condescending. I wanted to add the last one. I mean, at least for Africa, I don't know Latin America and Asia, I would imagine it's similar, but 80% of our economy runs on the informal sector. Across the continent, in some countries even more. Those are people who did not go to Harvard to have a master's. They do not, speak English, French, Italian, Spanish, and all of this kind of stuff. But that sector is working. So that tells us something about leadership, about teamwork, about collaboration, which is I say in quotes, traditional. Which is completely outside of this, NGO development model. So why not go there and say, what are you doing, man? When you're running your kiosk or your tailoring business or your whatever, how is that thing functioning after all these years without any of the fancy, degrees that we have? Because there's something there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point about locally led development is not just changing the color of the people that are in the room. I mean, you just have to also just look at the US context, right? And if you just look at it here, right, there's the same conversation about how do you get decision-making and power as close to, the issues and the people who are affecting it as possible. And that could be equally as true in a rural white community as it is in a very multicultural, African-American, Latino community, et cetera. And it's the same dialogue, but obviously it looks different in that particular context. So I think if we focus on that principle, right, then that's a clearer line of sight, right, to the opportunities that we're trying to promote here. Amy, there's a question in the chat from Patrick here about Indigenous leadership driving innovation. And so I think maybe I'll toss it to you first, because I think it relates very much to the work that you and your team have been doing and some of the voices you've tried to elevate here. So let me see if you have any thoughts on Patrick's question in the chat first. And you're on mute, Amy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Patrick's question says, how has your work in African communities supported local efforts to use indigenous leadership to drive innovation? Great question there, Patrick, and I'm excited to respond to that question. So for us, I think in my own work at Nuru Nigeria, like I said, recognizing cultural competence is very important if you really want to drive innovation and you want the indigenous people to actually lead themselves within the context of this developmental work. So what we have been doing in the context of Nuru Nigeria is go to the people on the ground and having conversations with them, co-create the activities with them. And not forgetting, I think one of the key things that happens when we come to this development work is sometimes we forget the why we are there, right? We forget the reason that took us there in the first place. The reason that we are there is, in all humility, is actually to restore. It's not because, like in our own case, it's not because the people never had before. They do. It's not because the people don't know what to do, or don't know the right solutions to their problem. They do. But even in restoring, you have to do it with a lot of high sense of dignity and respect for the people who are involved. Now, I will just talk about how indigenous innovation works for us in Nigeria. We come to this community that has been erased by Boko Haram, and all the communities that we work in are actually former Boko Haram caliphates, So what that means is that even if the person had like 1,000 cows, for example, which will translate into like almost $100,000, right? Even if the person had this, overnight it has been erased. And the person's name, from just being a community member, or being Amy has now changed multiple times. From being Amy to an internally displaced person, it has even changed to a refugee, to a returnee, it has changed to a person in displacement, and with all of these names that all this and everything that we have been doing, apart from just even the situation of the movement, the migration and everything that that comes with it, right? Apart from all of and everything, this person, you have to sit with this person to understand where they are now. You have to understand their readiness. Where are you right now? And where the person is right now might not be at the point where we have designed an activities that is for farmers, and we have said, oh, they are going to farm rice or this. No, the person might not be at that level. The person might be at the level where I need to talk about my daughter being raped in my presence. The person might be at the level where I need to talk about the fact that we've been abducted. I need to talk about my experience in the forest. That might be the level the person is. And then you need to connect the person to an actor in that particular sense. Then the other thing is, most of the things that we are bringing on board are not new to these people. So you have to also recognize that that's where the competence comes into play. They are not new to these people. So you need to discuss, we are talking about, oh, climate smart seed. What does climate smart seed, that is an innovation, and it's a very good innovation. But what does climate smart seed mean to this person? So we have had that experience in Nuru, Nigeria. We said, oh, the most viable seed at this point, even as a Nigerian, as somebody from the Northeast, and somebody who has been involved in this, I said, oh, with the soil testing results, with everything that we have done, the viable groundnut seed for this community might be just some 24. But when we came to the community said, oh, historically, we have already used some 24 before, and we have seen that the yield between Samnot 24 and Samnot 21, which is our traditional seed, the yield is lower with Samnot 24. And we asked, why could this be? Why are they thinking like this? We could give them Samnot 24, that's acceptable and all of those. But we had to come to the realization and agree with them. Okay, let us have demonstration plots. Demonstration plots that will show some not 24, some not 21, local seed, the improved variety and everything.
Okay, to be continued when Amy returns. I was going to move us to a couple of lightning round questions. However,
sorry,
oh, Amy's back. Okay, yes, continue, Amy.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I was saying that let's have a demonstration plot that shows how all of these innovation can work and how the yields are different, and we can be able to look at it and measure. And we did that. At the end of the day, we found out that what the community was actually pushing for, which is some not 21, is actually the best innovation that is suited for their community. So I think the humility in saying my research, what I have gotten, the global data and all of those does not fit this context is very key for indigenous innovation. Also, the humility of saying that, oh, I know that some of the knowledge that I might have gotten might not be compatible with the situation at this time is also important. The humility that has been designed by my donors will not work. We need to flip the script at this point. We need to change it to what the community wants. It's also important. And also the ability as an institution to reject funding. I think that's something that is very difficult for most people. The ability to reject funding, to say, oh, the mission that is driving us right now is locally led development. So the ability to sit in that room where the funding conversation is happening and saying, no, because it doesn't suit the community I serve, I'm not taking this money at this point in time. It's one key element that we need to also be able to utilize. So yes, to your question, Patrick, it can be difficult sometimes in terms of indigenous innovation, but it is also critical that we recognize it, because that's our own way of recognizing the local knowledge and the local competence that exists in that community. But never forget that your job there is restoration, and you have to do it with respect, dignity, and trust for the people.
Humility and respect are two themes that I think have just like basically been threaded through this entire conversation. And I think if we were to write a short summary, we would definitely lead with that. So yeah, we got about less than 20 minutes. I'm gonna basically go to two final questions as a way of giving each of you a chance to just kind of give a response to the same question. And doing so, I am going to try to weave into the last question, the question that Jenna just reposted in the chat from Kate. So, but the first question I want to ask is really giving you each an opportunity to kind of reflect on, is our sector as a whole being radical enough in terms of how we're thinking about flipping the script? Faye's already shaking her head. So Faye, you go first, then I'll go to Amy, then go to Princess, and then I'll come to the last question. So Faye, are we being radical enough?
No, just no. The answer is the sector is not being radical enough, right? The sector is still very tentative around the issues, and not having some of those hard conversations, the honest conversations that need to be had, and not making some of those hard decisions as well that are required for really a kind of a change there. So, and that's just the reality. So and I'll put it this way, because we also work with a lot of private sector clients. The same debates that are happening in the international INGO sector, in private sector actually nobody's talking about our local. It's like, can you do finance, yes or no? Are you good at marketing, yes or no? It's not, I'm getting a local head of marketing and I'm going to do capacity building. I mean, it's in the same way, I think for all of you on the call, when you are working with your partners in Europe or Canada, whatever, you're in a consortium, you don't call them my local partners in Canada. You call them my consortium members. So even in the language itself, it's already kind of very condescending. And I always say that in NGOs, you tend to have kind of 3 levels of staff. You have the HQ staff, which are very, very important people. Then you have the international, or in quotes, expert staff, also very important people. And then you have the local guys who are also kind of there. So definitely enough is being done, because we are still struggling to let go of the old. And I'm not saying it's going to happen overnight. I understand, this whole development work all the way from the 50s, 60s, post-independence. Some of the conversations you're having today about accountability, transparency, that's been there since the 60s. That is not new. This sector is, Chris, I'm very passionate. I asked you before, can I speak honestly? But this sector is almost one of the slowest to evolve that I have ever seen when it comes to changing anything. But very good at holding meetings, conferences, workshops in wherever, Joburg, to sit together, writing policy papers, but not a lot of action behind it, actually. Over.
Okay, Amy, over to you. You want to pick up on that and say anything more about how radical we're being and ways to be more radical?
All right, so I will say, Chris, I would like to say, please permit me to keep my video off because my network is a bit unstable.
Fine.
So I would like to say, are we being radical enough? I think we like the idea of localization. We like the idea of locally led development. We are so in love with the idea, but I feel like sometimes we are not ready to do the work in ensuring that it happens the way we imagine the idea, because really it's quite difficult. Because if you're going to do actual localization and ensure that communities are leading themselves, right? The communities that you serve, you have to do away with a lot of the beliefs and everything that you have had all the things that you have gathered, all the tools you have gathered in an MBA on strategic decision making and all of those, theory X and theory Y has to be dropped, because the reality on the ground is going to actually shake all of those theories. It's not that they are not important. They are very important. In fact, they were the ones that got us to this place that we are in now, even being able to have this kind of difficult conversation. However, we need to do more to push it. We need to, just like we set indicators on projects and all of those, we need to be very intentional about setting, okay, in the next 2 years, localization needs to happen, and this is what localization means. So everybody in this sector needs to sit and define what localization means for their own organization. I would like to also point out that organizations like, of course, the Nuru Collective and what Stopping at Success are doing in terms of local transitioning is very, very important. Like, because Stopping at Success, what we do with them is, for me, I found the accompaniment program very important for my transitioning, like from all the knowledge I've gathered and all of those. So if we have organizations like them who actually ensure that transitions are done responsibly and transitions are done in terms of the local context, and there is also respect for the competence that the local institution has, there is also a shift in the power, which is very important. The shift in the power needs to happen, and it needs to happen really fast if localization will happen, So they ensure that, the power shift. And also, when it is happening, sometimes there is also fear that comes with it. I spoke earlier about legitimacy. There is also the fear that comes with it. So it is good to have an ally, someone like Stopping at Success, to help you unpack some of your fears, like have a sounding board to speak with. I think during the time when Nuru International was exiting Nigeria, my two major fears were legitimacy. When I enter an institutional setting with Nuru International, immediately the white person, the accent, the everything that comes into play, the connection, we are going to talk about all of this, the research that is done, all the connections, the right connection, the facial expression, the hugs, and everything happened in the room, So it was easier than when I am coming into the room as a Black woman, as an African, as a Nigerian, who has been tagged several years with the element of, Nigerians are corrupt, Nigerians are this, Nigerians are that. When I'm coming into that room alone, what happens? So that was something that Stopping at Success has helped me unpack. The second thing that they have also helped me unpack on my journey is the funding and partnership aspect. For me to even sit at a global stage like this, I had to have an athlete, an ally like Stopping at Success to recommend me, So on this journey, it is not easy. The short response to your question is, no, we are not radical enough until we decide to set the number of years, what it means, and we decide to really explicitly define it. In this context, this is what localization means. In terms of funding, local actors being sub-guarantees means localization. Local actors being prime means localization. Local actors, we have to clearly, explicitly define it and put a number of years to it. We need to put a time frame to this target, just like we have done to the SDGs. We know that 2030 is fast approaching and everybody is working hard. So we need to put a target to all institutions, to all government, and say this is the time. But for local actors, a key takeaway, right? In the room where your cultural competence is being recognized, in the room where your voice is being recognized, also ensure that you are trustworthy. Also ensure that what you are receiving, you are really trustworthy of it, because I want to continue to emphasize that you represent a very loud voice that cannot speak at the stage where you are speaking. And you need allies on the journey. Localization does not mean that all the international actors and international friends that we have are not good for us. You need allies on the journey. You need people who will continue to amplify your voice and the voices of the community you serve. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amy. And yeah, thank you for really on a few points there, driving home also, yeah, the point of allies and accompaniment and supports for you as a local leader, especially. Princess, you want to add anything on radical? And then we'll go to the last question.
No, no, we're not being radical enough. So I definitely share the same sentiment. And I think from where I sit definitely as a DEI practitioner, the industry of DEI, the technical aspect of DEI has become the scapegoat of that, right, in this space, right? That DEI isn't doing enough, or DEI this, DEI that. And I think what I find in the space is that, right, we are drowning in knowledge, right? There's knowledge, there's workshops, there's trainings, there's this, but we are starving for action. And it's the action of DEI, of socializing it, of contextualizing it so that local leaders and regions and different areas of the world can make it their own, is where that radicalness starts to happen. And so, no, and though that as we start to continue, begin to continue to have these conversations and start to actually act on the principles, especially principles around DEI, we will start to see the ownership change and the power shift change, and it become more actionable.
Great, thank you, Princess. So before I go to the last question, I just want to remind everybody that we are summarizing all of the webinars from last year's locally led development webinar series into a final culmination report that will be available in our email, social, and website in this coming week. And if you're not actually following us on LinkedIn or on our email newsletter, you can find a way to subscribe to those things on our website. So the last question, I want to make it really personable and really actionable and give you each a chance to weigh in. And I'll stick with you, Princess, while you have the mic, and then I'll go to Faye, and then I'll give Amy the last shot at it, which is for everybody on the call here. And this gets to the question we had in the chat, is like, what is the one actionable thing you want us all doing as leaders that we can be doing in our own organizations to shift culture and basically take this whole conversation and make it very actionable? So Princess, over to you. Like, what is the one thing you want us all doing, individually as a leader, setting aside sort of all the policy issues, et cetera?
Yeah, I think I'd just add like my last one word, which would be vulnerability. And I think that the times where I have had the best mentors and the best examples of leadership are those leaders who have been vulnerable. So talking about the challenges and the concerns is my action call of giving, now that we have this knowledge and we have these terms, we are not at a lack for terms and acronyms. There's language abundant to begin to say these things out loud and to have that vulnerability. And I think it is the trust, other words that we said today, but getting to the space where we can have honest conversations, talk about the challenges, where leaders can talk about how hard this is and how they need support and learn from each other, where middle managers can talk about how do I actionalize this, even when people get emails, team meetings, right? It happens at these very micro levels as well as, right, macro and micro levels of change. And so that vulnerability, just as much as a meeting in Geneva, right? Also the vulnerability levels that you have in your one-on-ones with your direct supervisor. And so just carrying that call to be vulnerable and take your agency to say when things are not as they should be, right? Calling out your experience, saying this happened, I'm seeing this isn't aligned with what we have on our website. My experience isn't aligned with what we say we do. And then the same thing, right? For leaders to say, this is hard, where can I find support? Where can I find the answers to do pay better, to do promotions better, to better have recruiters, right? To say out loud, it's hard for me to find the person in this region to fill this role. Where can I find local support or local consultant or a local hiring agency to help me do this? So just really being vulnerable about the issues and the challenges is my call. Over.
Great, thank you, Vol. So vulnerability, over to you, Faye, for your call to action.
Two things: inquiry before judgment. So that goes back to the, the mental models, but also what Amy was saying. When she first stepped into the room, she knows that there's a lot of mental models and judgments which have already been made because you know what does a head of program look like, etc. So it's inquiry before judgment. Challenge yourself on when you start to feel that, like, yes, but the problem is with you. Take a step back first and be like, what mental model, what narrative am I telling myself about indigenous knowledge, local communities, what corruption, all of these things. So Amy, I'm glad you brought that up because we deal with that as well. Being an African company, it's always high risk dealing with us. And so those are mental models which you're bringing to the table, which, and the second one is going back to what Princess was saying, is courage over comfort. Like Princess says, when something is off and it doesn't feel right. And when you're choosing to stay quiet and to say, I'm not going to bring it up, I'm just going to leave it, what you're doing is a cowardly choice. That is the reality. So I'm not saying you need to always be courageous, but then be honest to say, I'm being a coward right now because I'm not challenging something which I know is wrong, and I'm not challenging it because for my own sense of security, peace. So inquiry before judgment and courage over comfort. That's it.
Thank you, Faye. Amy, what would you give everyone as a final takeaway, actionable leadership skill they can employ?
So I think I will say at the end of this is that as leaders, we have to also be able to do away with our unconscious biases. Sometimes the issues of cultural competence are just basically because of our unconscious biases. So we have to do away with our unconscious biases. And back to what Princess was saying about vulnerability, we must have the emotional maturity to handle a room that does not share the same idea with us. We have to be, as Faye has said, we have to be comfortable in that room where our idea is not the premium idea. We have to be comfortable in that room where our idea is being debunked. We have to have the emotional maturity to handle situations where our knowledge, strategy, mission, visions are all challenged, and we have to also be able to accommodate that. We have to also grow to the level of leadership maturity where we are able to recognize the individual competencies that people bring into every room. I will keep emphasizing cultural competence, right? And this means this is beyond just the educational qualification and all of those. No, it is the innate ability of a person, so we have to be able to have the leadership maturity to have that sense of recognition. But if you want to take anything, you have to be very intentional too. Be very intentional and accommodating as leaders. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great closings from all three of you, Amy, Faye, and Princess. It's been a total joy to have this conversation with you today. I'm always mindful, Adrienne Marie Brown says the role of the facilitator is to find the conversation that's happening in the room and go there. I hope I did that for the three of you today as best as I could. We could have gone for another hour and a half, but thank you all. Thank you, Jenna, for bringing us all together and coordinating, and for also just, doing a great job moderating the chat as always. So again, thanks everyone for here. I think we all have some very concrete takeaways that we can literally deploy this afternoon, I think, this evening. And again, a big thank you to Faye, Princess, and Amy for sharing all of your insights and experiences on this topic. Jenna, anything else from the close?
Nope, that is it. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we'll be sure to send out the recording. And in the meantime, I did put a link in the chat to register for the rest of our series. We'll be back in June talking about flipping the script on funding. So getting into what Amy was talking about actually refusing funding that isn't useful. So stay tuned and join us for that. So thank you all for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day and evening wherever you are.
Thanks,
Bye,
everybody.